In 1961, in January, Kennedy was inaugurated. He had several problems, including Ho Chi Minh's popularity was increasing and Diem's popularity was decreasing. And more importantly, South Vietnam's Viet Cong population was growing. Bad. His plan, Kennedy's plan, was to increase the number of U.S. military advisors in Vietnam, and he did. In 1954, there were 700. In 1961, there were 2,000, and in 1962, there were 11,000. He also planned to have counterinsurgency operations to counteract the Viet Cong growth. And thirdly, he wanted to encourage Diem to reform, because Diem was a Catholic and very anti-Buddhist, which is not typical, by the way, in a 90% Buddhist country. So that doesn't work out very well. Only about 100 soldiers died in Vietnam under Kennedy. In 1963, the war in Vietnam was failing. Vietnamese didn't really like what the U.S. was doing. For instance, we were using napalm and Agent Orange. I don't think that they had a right, or I think they had a right to not like us. We were pretty cruel. Secondly, the U.S. Was associated with Diem, and Diem was Catholic and anti-Buddhist, and kept the money that the U.S. sent for Vietnam. Ngo Dinh Nhu was Diem's brother, and he was the head of the secret police. Diem authorized him to open fire on unarmed protesting Buddhists. What the heck, man? It's not okay. And Madame Nhu, who was Ngo Dinh Nhu's wife, referred to the Buddhist monk who set himself on fire as Buddhist barbecue and said that they needed a few more. There's just something wrong with that. In 1963, the U.S. publicly denounced Diem and cut off his economic ties. On November 1st, the CIA was authorized to encourage the South Vietnam military to lead a coup d'etat against Diem. Diem and his brother were killed, and 1 week later, Kennedy was assassinated in Texas while campaigning. This led to some problems. Diem was the U.S. president in Vietnam, and so when Diem was assassinated, this led to instability. And from November of 1963 through 1965, there were 12 governments in South Vietnam. Yeah, they were a little unstable. Secondly, Kennedy's assassination led to President Johnson, and so the U.S. was adapting since Johnson was Kennedy's vice president. We supported Diem because Diem was synonymous with democracy in South Vietnam, so to win, the U.S. needed Diem, and winning meant containment, which means keeping communism out of South Vietnam. So even though Diem sucked as a person, we still needed him to accomplish our goals. So, yeah. So, Kennedy's foreign policy was flexible response, which is basically we increase everything, from nuclear weapons to conventional weapons to the CIA, everything. We thought that the Soviet Union was aggressive and diverse, and so the U.S. needed to be able to counter it. The U.S. is the most powerful country in the world, and so we needed to be able to face anyone, anytime, anywhere, any way. It didn't really work. I mean, it sort of did, but you'll understand later why. So why did we choose flexible response? Well, Kennedy thought that Eisenhower's massive retaliation was crazy. It's essentially nuclear blackmail. No. Secondly, it's a political break from Eisenhower. Third, it increases the options. And we thought that the Soviet Union was going to be everywhere convincing people to have a communist revolution, and so the U.S. needed to be able to stop it. Yeah. So what exactly does it do? Well, flexible response increases the flexibility to respond to the Soviet Union. That's not in the name or anything, no. Secondly, it increases spending. Military spending increased 13% under Kennedy, and this is the first time that the U.S. had a significant deficit. But we thought that an increase in spending leads to an increase in production, which increases jobs, which increases revenue, which then increases spending and repeats the cycle altogether. In 1961, Kennedy threatened military intervention in Laos, and Khrushchev backed down. In 1962, Laos became neutral. So there were some similarities between Eisenhower and Kennedy. They created a nuclear stockpile. They used covert operations. They had an emphasis on science and math. For instance, the Apollo program, which was basically a program to accomplish Kennedy's goal of sending a man to the moon before 1970, and they did it in 1969. If you're an Even Stevens fan, you probably know this based on that musical episode. It's the only episode I remember, but it sticks with me. Anyway, both were willing to negotiate with the communists. Both Eisenhower and Kennedy were against limited war. They believed in the domino theory, and that Vietnam was critical to containment. And they believed that China was involved in Vietnam. Obviously, there were some differences between Eisenhower and Kennedy. Eisenhower emphasized nuclear, whereas Kennedy emphasized everything. Eisenhower also emphasized effects more, and Kennedy emphasized causes. Now, what were some of Kennedy's positives? He stood up to Khrushchev. The change in power in the U.S., plus Kennedy being the youngest president, made Khrushchev test Kennedy a lot. But Kennedy always stood his ground and showed that he really was a strong president and such. Yeah. He also had sound crisis management. He knew when to be the tough guy and when to compromise. And thirdly, he improved relations. During his presidency, there was a direct line between the White House and the Kremlin. He also invented the Peace Corps, which is basically an organization that goes to third world countries and helps them. They did this because it's the right thing to do, and if you remember Kennedy's quote of, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," it applied here. Secondly, this helped ease strains between the US and Latin America, and the real reason that Kennedy supported it deterred communism, because the poorer a country is, the more likely they are to become communist. So if you're combating poverty, you're also combating communism. A fourth positive of Kennedy's was that he maintained nuclear and technological superiority. And fifth, he came up with flexible response. So that's more options. It doesn't mean we have to blow up the world. It's good. However, there were some negatives. His Alliance for Progress fell short. It wanted too much, and most of the money never even got to the people because of corrupt governments, and it was very costly. Second, the Bay of Pigs invasion. Third, Laos was never actually neutral. The US restrictions made it hard to fight in Vietnam. And fourth, he increased soldiers, and there was an increase in Viet Cong. So really, the situation was worse after Kennedy and not better, because we had more of our boys over in Vietnam, and the communists in South Vietnam and all over were increasing.